Hey Ding Dongs, I'm Jamie.
I am Richard.
And this is Explain It to Jamie, the political comedy podcast in which I, Jamie, a politically innocent but curious young man, have the complicated political happenings of the world explained to me by my sleeveless friend, Richard Lamb.
It's true. You really, in order to fully appreciate the audio of this episode, you have to know that I'm sleeveless.
Yeah.
The slight difference in frequencies emanating through the airwaves is caused by the lack of sleeves in the room right now.
It's important. This sound right now?
Yeah.
That's Richard masturbating.
It's true. It's mostly slap based.
Yeah.
I've been watching some freaky shit on tentaclecrazy.jp.gov.
Wow, and the crazy shit on tentaclefun.jp.gov is
Yeah,
especially
really
nutty.
That's right. It's the deep end, man. I've seen things no man should see.
Oh man, Richard, we're back off a week off.
That's right. I was in New Orleans last week.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
And how does it feel to have been to New Orleans?
Honestly, it feels great.
Yeah?
New Orleans is really cool.
Music, fried
It's
chicken,
incredible music. There's great cooking.
Gators.
Yeah. It's also just really interesting being in a place that has such a different mentality as Toronto. Toronto is kind of a go city. It's yeah, we're important. And then there's a sort of insecurity in how important Toronto thinks of itself as, but it is the financial and cultural capital of our country. I mean, it's debatable maybe if you're French. If you're French, it's not any of those things.
Right.
But it's the biggest city in our country, and there's kind of everyone's doing something. What are you doing today? I'm doing this, this, and this in Toronto. That in Louisiana, people are yeah, I walked through the swamp today, and then I went back the same way. Swamp changed, path was gone. It's oh well, probably going to be a hurricane. They have this kind of remarkable, they literally live in a landscape that's constantly shifting, so that they don't, even the country they exist in is not the same. They went back, and you just have to assume something horrible is going to happen to you. But there's a kind of a laissez-faire attitude about it, because they are also a former French colony, and there's still a real French attitude down there.
Cool.
Yeah, it's really cool.
Cool. I think Toronto's slogan is actually really aptly "We're important."
Yeah,
but in the context of nobody asked.
Yeah, that's right.
You're in a coffee shop and you just said it. Everybody stopped and looked at you.
Yeah,
and
that's
continued
right.
what they were doing.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's our podcast this week on Richard's vacation in New Orleans.
Come back, tune into Richard's vacation diary next week when I talk about the time I went to Boston when I was 12 years old.
Oh boy, can't wait for that one. No, guys,
tricked ya.
It tricked ya. The theme is Confederation.
That's right.
Canada's Confederation.
Canada's Confederation. So
Woo.
all of you American listeners who've been waiting with bated breath to finally hear the founding myth of Canada, here it is, unmasked for you at last.
I can hardly wait. I'm very, very excited.
So Jamie, why is it that you want to know about Confederation?
Well, here we are in the tail end of June, approaching July 1st, Confederation Day, the day of the death of the French Canadian nation.
Wow.
When it inked on parchment, a bunch of sovereign states were united under one government.
That's kind of right.
Yeah.
I mean, they weren't sovereign states.
Oh.
So that's not right.
I just like that word. I try and throw it in anytime I feel it's available to me.
Yeah, I've noticed that.
Yeah.
I've noticed you've been texting me that every hour on the hour for the last several weeks.
Yeah. Do you mind if we actually take a break? Because I have to take a sovereign bathroom break.
Oh, I see what you did there.
Thank you.
Okay, well, Confederation, it's going to be a real sexy and interesting time, everybody. We're about to talk about several meetings, and, at one of which someone may have flirted with somebody.
Oh, my God.
Confederation has a really dry reputation among Canadians. I think most Canadians know Confederation happened, and they know that it happened. I feel like all Canadians have heard the term Confederation.
Sure.
All Canadians know it has something to do with July 1st. Then most Canadians know that it happened on July 1st, 1867. Mm-hmm. And now some Canadians know that John A. Macdonald was involved,
Right.
and then vastly fewer Canadians know anything more than that. Like, I think the next level of information is probably people are like, July 1st, 1867 in Charlottetown, question mark? Which is
Sure.
wrong. Which is wrong.
Sure.
Right? So now we're already into like people don't actually know what the deal is. So let's get into it. We're gonna come out of this with an encyclopedic fucking knowledge of Confederation and all of its ins and outs.
Well, I can barely wait. It's a long song.
Yeah.
I don't feel like doing that bit all the way through it.
No. Okay. Are we past the theme song now? I don't even know where we are anymore.
I don't know. Why don't we just throw it in now?
Okay, great.
Ah! Lost a week, but no rustier than before.
No, we're firing on all cylinders here today, folks. Okay, so Jamie, what is it that you do know about Confederation?
Okay, it wasn't in Charlottetown. The reason it's called Confederation is because it was signed by John A. Macdonald
Yeah.
and a guy called Fred.
Did you say?
Which is what Fredericton is named after.
Did you just say Confederation?
Yeah, Confederation.
Oh,
Because
Confederation.
it's signed by Fred.
Confederation.
The founder of Fredericktown.
Confederation is like when a dude named Fred who smokes a lot of weed, like it's like a poster he has on his door. It's like, do not enter the Confederate States of America within. Passport required, homies.
Yeah. It'd be like a Fox vehicle for like an insult comic. It's like our United States of Confederation. Or something like that.
Okay. You're wrong. So Confederation it was the event in which brought together the separate colonies of what was called British North America into a single sovereign country, which was called Canada.
Right.
And it happened in the year 1867. And it didn't all happen at once. Like, the country that we know as Canada came into being piece by piece over many, many, many years. Like, in 1867, what was the colonies that confederated were just what was called the province of Canada, which included Canada East and Canada West, which are now Quebec and Ontario, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia.
Right.
So just those four at first.
Yeah.
Then British Columbia joined in 1871, Prince Edward Island in 1875, Manitoba in 79 question mark when the Red River Rebellion was. And then after the sale of what was called Rupert's Land from the Hudson's Bay Company back to the Canadian government, Rupert's Land was like everything else that is now in Canada that wasn't in Canada yet.
Right.
Then basically they just had to figure out how to divide it all up into what's now modern day Alberta and Saskatchewan, the Yukon and the Northwest Territories. So that happened kind of through the late 19th century. And then finally, Newfoundland joined in 1949, which took them a long time. And they had their,
good for them, though.
Yeah, they had their reasons for doing that. So already, it's impossible, I think, in this day and age to talk about Confederation and to talk about how Canada became a country without comparing absolutely everything to the United States. And I think it's actually pretty helpful.
Right.
It's helpful for us to think about how much as Canadians we know about the founding of the United States. Like, you probably know more about the founding of the United States than you do about Canada if you're an average Canadian person, right?
Yeah,
like, you know about what the Declaration of Independence is, kind of, right? You've heard of George Washington. You know there was a Revolutionary War.
Yeah.
Like,
he had a hard time lying,
Yeah, that's right.
as I understand.
Yeah.
Because of his teeth or something, right?
Yeah, these are all like weird stories that are mixed up with me too. Didn't he cut down, like, it's like some weird story where he cut down a cherry tree?
He cut down the cherry tree,
And
and
then
then his mom came home and he's like, who cut this down? He says, I cut it down. I cannot tell a lie.
Yeah.
And so they were like, see? He can't tell a lie.
That's what
I rest
that
my
was like
case.
That was like hard-hitting political advertising back in the day. Like nowadays, it's like Rebel Media says that Justin Trudeau is a gay Muslim faggot. Like how far we've come. Hey.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. No. So it's useful to look at it in comparison
in a
to
lot
the
of
United
ways,
States.
Donald Trump can't seem to tell a lie either
It's true.
because
Or no, I mean. He lies constantly,
Right.
but he also it's like it's weird because he's constantly lying, but then also constantly
But
like
because it's so
accidentally
consistent.
revealing things. like he just seems to have no filter.
right.
You know?
Yeah, information just falls out of that guy.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
No, but it's helpful for us to compare Confederation to the American story, because in a lot of ways. The British North American colonies that weren't part of the United States faced a lot of the same tensions and pressures as the United States did and had to deal with them in similar ways, except because the United States was always the richer, more plentiful colony, because it had way more agricultural land on which much more profitable agriculture could be done, more people always went there. More people were attracted to the United States. It was like it had more promise than the Canadian colonies. And so everything boiled faster in the United States, and they dealt with all the problems first. And so when it was Canada's turn to deal with all of the problems of being a colony ruled by Britain from afar,
Right.
A, the American Revolution had already happened, and B, they happened staggered way farther apart than a lot of the American ones did.
Right.
So that's kind of useful immediately to think of, because Confederation is considered to be, Canadian history as a whole is considered to be boring, and Confederation is one of the first boring ass step on the long journey of Canadian history. And
Right.
it is like a little bit dry.
Well, when I was a little kid, the sort of like the joke on the playground was that the United States, and how national identity followed this, but the United States took their freedom by force,
Yeah.
and Canada asked nicely, and that's the way it's been
Right.
ever since.
Right. But you know what? Here right away, this is what I'm talking about is when America declared its independence from Britain, it did multiple things at once. America was angry, the slogan of the American Revolution was taxation without representation is tyranny, right? They were being taxed by the monarchy, like their goods, their agriculture were being, a chunk of it was being taken by Britain all the time, and they had no say in how much of it was getting taken, how the shit was being spent. At the time, the head of a colony, which is like a state or a province now, it was a governor general or a lieutenant governor. That's what they were called, and we still have them in our provinces. And the lieutenant governors were like little kings. They could do anything. They were like the unelected presidents of these little colonies, and they could take whatever they felt like, hire whoever they wanted, and do whatever they fucking wanted to do. And they were like seriously problematic. Like people really were pissed off at them because they were arbitrary, and whatever whim they had,
Right.
they would see through. And they are also part of the like British colonial imperial machine. They were all nobility. They were well-connected British people who looked down on the average person. That was like the British class structure, right? So these are the tensions that caused the American Revolution. And the American Revolution resulted in a big popular uprising against these people because they weren't being represented, right?
Right.
Now, so that happened in 1776 until 1789, I believe. No, quicker than that. 1776 until the mid 1780s. Did it go as long as 1789? I don't know. I have to listen to Hamilton again or something. Anyway, somebody tweet me when the end of the Revolutionary War was in America.
Great.
But so in Canada, really modern day Canada was created in 1763. So let's go all the way back to before Confederation, right?
Whoa!
Yeah, right. So
Ooh, look at all the trees.
yeah, so there's this thing that starts in 1756 called the 7 Years' War. And the 7 Years' War was this big war between France, England, and Spain.
And it lasted for 9 years.
Yeah, that's right. It lasted 9 years. No, this one did actually last 7 years.
Oh.
Yeah. The
Yeah,
100
I'm
Years
sure it
War
did.
lasted like 100. No, there's all kinds of like numerical wars that aren't actually.
Is it because they named it before it was over? They were just guessing? They're like, those guys look pretty angry. I bet we're not going to get this wrapped up in 15.
Shit like that has happened though. Like Hitler said that the Third Reich was 1,000-year Reich. They used to call it that, and he got like what 7, 9 out of it.
Right.
There's a huge World War II museum in New Orleans, by the way, so all my World War II shit is fresh in the brain.
Huh.
No, so in 1756, there's the 7 Years' War. It's a big war between Britain, France, and Spain, but it's not fought in Europe. It's fought in North America and in all of their colonies. It's like a big proxy war where they're all like jockeying to have the best colonies, right?
Right.
And long story short, Britain beats France. In the big turning point in what's now Canada was the Battle of the Plains of Abraham, which happened in 1759, which is where like the British army kind of defeated the French army in Quebec City. Then they could take Quebec City. They held it for a long time. Blah, 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 blah. In 1763, the war ends, and there's the Treaty of Paris, which ends the war. And in the Treaty of Paris, the French king gave like the Nouvelle France, like the French Canadian colonies to Britain. And under the condition, because this wasn't an unconditional surrender, this was a conditional surrender, that they could have freedom of religion. So remember, the British are Protestants and the French are Catholics, right? And at the time, religion was so intensely linked with society that this essentially meant that they could also keep their language, their culture, all these things. And the British agree. So right away, 1763, the Treaty of Paris, in writing, it says like, okay, the British get the French colonies, but the French people basically just get to keep living their lives like French people. You're not going to strip them of their language. You're not going to force them to be Protestant. You're not going to do any of this shit.
Yeah.
Right? And from that point, that was Canada's unstable equation, right? These two formerly separate colonies were welded together. They used to be two totally different countries, and suddenly they were under the control of one country, and suddenly Britain had to make all of them happy. Right. And the second that happened, there was tension. And in America, the tension was between the slave-holding states and the non-slave-holding states, right? So when America was created, boom, there's a new country, and half the states own slaves, and half of them don't, and they hate each other. And it's a huge problem. Every time new states enter the United States, there's a big debate over whether they're going to be slave states or not, because tipping the balance of power between the states towards slave states or away from them would mean like that side won or lost, right? And this moral debate boils and boils and boils in the United States history until the Civil War explodes and there's massive, massive bloodshed over it, right? In Canada, it happened just on the same things happened just on a smaller scale, right? So French Canada and English Canada are kind of trucking along. They have these shitty authoritarian lieutenant governors, the same ones that they had in America that caused the Revolutionary War. We had the same thing, and people also don't like them, and they don't like how arbitrary they are. And the Canadian elected Canadian governments don't like them because they, the Parliament will be like, hey, we passed this law to do this, and the lieutenant governor's like, great, I don't like it, and I won't do it. And then they have no recourse. Like, they can't do anything about that. Right? So everyone's pissed at them. In 1837, in both French Canada, in what was called Lower Canada at the time, and Upper Canada, which was Ontario. So in Quebec, I'll just call them Quebec and Ontario. They were called different shit at different times. So in Quebec and Ontario, there were rebellions. There were armed rebellions. Nowhere near on the scale of the American ones, but serious armed rebellions with like 1,000 to 2,000 people like uprising against the government and being shot and killed and fought against by the British troops.
Right.
And when this happened, Britain was like, we got a problem here. And remember, this happened after the American Revolution. So they were like, we don't want that to happen again. We maybe need to think about cutting these Canadians some slack. So the first thing they tried to do was they combined Quebec and Ontario into one province. And this is going to be really important eventually. So they combined Upper Canada and Lower Canada into one big province called Canada. And they split Quebec and Ontario, the French part and the English part, apart from each other and called them Canada East was the French part and Canada West was the English part. And when it came time to like figure out how they were gonna make it make sense, like how they were gonna structure the government, what ended up happening was they went for what's called sectional equality, which just means like half of the seats are in the French part and half of the seats are in the English part. That's it, right? It has nothing to do with population. It has nothing to do with anything else. It's like 50% are in the French territory, 50% in the English territory. Figure it out yourselves, guys.
Which obviously isn't 100% fair.
No,
because it's not representation by
population, right? Which was a huge issue, for a lot of people, especially English people, because the English side remember, it's not a French colony anymore. It's a British colony. So British colonists are still coming over. There's lots of British immigration to Canada, and those people are going to the English part because they don't want to go to the French part. Right.
Yeah, I think actually the number is there's 250,000 more Ontario people than Quebec, but they have the same number of seats.
That's correct.
Yeah.
So it was just getting more and more unsustainable over this time. The other so that happens in 1841, that the two provinces get joined up. And then everything kind of trucks along for about 6 years, but there's still this problem of bad representation, right? Like the lieutenant governors, and this is true too in New Brunswick and Nova Scotia and Prince Edward Island and all the other sort of like maritime colonies. There's just they're just in deadlock all the time. They're fighting these lieutenant governors. They're seen as arbitrary. They're super unpopular. They're snooty, arrogant, entitled, and they don't have any regard of Canadian people who live there, right? And so there's this huge push for this thing that we have now called responsible government. This is one of the most important terms of Confederation. So responsible government is a thing that we still have today, and it's literally just the concept that like when the Parliament decides something, the lieutenant governor has to do it, right? They have to do it,
right?
And especially it comes into play with like appointing people to positions.
Right. How much area of land would a lieutenant governor be responsible for?
The entire province.
Oh, okay.
So there's like Quebec, Canada had a lieutenant governor. Nova Scotia has a lieutenant governor, like that. Yeah.
Right.
They would be like the head of state, the president, like the president.
Okay.
Yeah, because they're the executive, right?
Right.
They appoint cabinet, right? They appoint like the minister of defense. They appoint the minister of agriculture. Like they appoint the kind of main bureaucrats, and that was what the big change was, right? So suddenly. So Canada fights and fights and fights for responsible government, the Canadian legislatures, and then they get it. They get it in 1847. And instantly, what that means is that it's Parliament's job to appoint people. And that means actually that it's whoever the Prime Minister's job is to appoint people. All of a sudden, the system we have today where the Prime Minister of the legislature becomes the most important figure instantly appears in Canadian politics and has been that way ever since.
Right.
It's also important to note a lot of the dudes, because they're all dudes, who were the fathers of Confederation, quote unquote, did this. This was their first huge legal battle in Parliament. A lot of them were young guys in 1847 when this was a huge, like, all colonies political issue. And so they all fought this battle and they all kind of won it. And they all came of age in the new system.
So here's a question.
Yes.
This is probably going to take us back. We were talking about armed revolts in Ontario, Quebec earlier. Yeah. Was that what the Papineau Rebellion was about?
Actually, I don't know. I think so. Yes.
Okay.
Yes, it was. That was the Quebec version. That was the French half of it. The English and French ones they're ideologically the same. Like they happen for the same reasons, but they're not linked.
Right.
They're like separate and simultaneous, kind of.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So now we've got the position of Prime Minister that's available.
Yeah, I mean, it always existed, but suddenly now the Prime Minister is the boss.
Right.
Because whoever the majority party in Parliament says, hey, this guy's going to do this thing in the government, now they have to do it, right? It used to be like the Parliament would be like, hey, we love this guy Johnny. We think he should be the head of fisheries. And the Lieutenant Governor would be like, yes, you know what? My cousin's going to do it. Right. So now the Prime Minister picks everybody who does it.
Right. Enter John A. Macdonald.
Yeah, that's right. So
the joint premier.
So what I wanted to make clear now is that already by 1867, Canada has had armed rebellions that freaked the British government out, and because those armed rebellions happened, they got their representation, right? So taxation without representation is tyranny. That didn't apply anymore in Canada.
Right.
Suddenly there was representation. Suddenly Canadian people were in charge of themselves, even though they never had to fight a rebellion for it.
Right. Kind of because of what just happened in the United States.
Undeniably.
So there's a big fuss built up in the U.S.
Yeah.
The British fought maybe a little harder then to keep hold. They lost hold. And then when Canada started acting up, they just went,
that's right.
We'll just take this.
Another interesting dynamic about Canada is that, in theory, the power that they just had won with responsible government just kind of put them on equal footing with the British Parliament. Except way, way, way more people in Canada could vote than in Britain. Like the franchise, that's what they call the number of people who are eligible to vote, was way broader because just like in Britain, it was tied to land, and it was like whoever's the head of the household of a certain size piece of property, it's like it's always men, only men could vote, but like whoever was like the head of the household on a certain size of property, that person could vote for that household. And in Britain, not very many of the like large number of Brits owned property. There were like 10,000 people who could vote in all of Britain, and they were all like wealthy aristocrats or like middle class maximum, right? But in Canada, the average person owned enough property to vote. Like, so it was a way more egalitarian kind of society, and that meant the legislatures had a mandate from the actual people in a way that a lot of other actual, like that Britain actually didn't. So that was another part of this vibe, is like the people actually became represented in Parliament. And elections in this time were crazy too, because like each riding had about 1,000 people. Just like today, it was really heavily split between Liberals and Conservatives. They were the major parties. And so generally it was like 400 people would always vote for the Liberal, 400 people would always vote for the Conservative, and then the other 200 were like up for grabs, and you had to convince those two, like the guys in the riding would be in the riding talking to those people. Everyone knew who everyone was. And it was a really personal kind of world for the politicians, and like you had a really personal relationship to like the people running in your riding, because either you were their supporter, so you were showing up for them, trying to convince people for them, or they were trying to convince you to vote for them.
Right.
And occasionally they would just pay you money to vote for them.
I was gonna say, there was lots of bribery.
There was tons of
corruption
vote buying and corruption. That's right. But it's funny, and then it was a huge worry at the time, is like, oh, the poors are just going to have their votes bought and paid for, which did happen. Of course, eventually it just became, it devolved away from that. But I mean, we'll get into that a bit. But like, it was kind of an interesting time in Canadian politics because everything was so small scale. It was so real. Like it was a functioning democracy in a way that it isn't anymore, in that the representatives were really responsible to the people.
Right.
It wasn't a functioning democracy in the sense that no women or indigenous people or like Asians or blacks could vote.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. So 1 second. Because this is such a dry topic, I'm going to take this second right now to sort of catch up right now where we're at.
Okay, great.
Thank you. And then we can figure out trajectory. So there's the 7 Years' War, which was between Britain, France, and Spain, all in colonies in North America.
Correct.
Britain won. Mm-hmm. The parcels of land, or the French won ownership of North America?
At the time, the French and British both had colonies in North America. Right? And they were like countries at war with each other.
Yes.
And so Britain won the French colonies. Britain got to control them.
I see. And then parceled together Quebec and Ontario.
Yeah, that's right.
As like a single unit, creating tension.
Right. As a fun note, remember, they get to keep their French culture and language. They're not forced to convert to Protestantism, which is what happened when the British conquered Acadia, right? Acadie, which was another French colony. They forced them either to convert to Protestantism or be forcefully deported and expelled. And they were, a lot of them were deported and expelled, and they ended up in Louisiana, where they became, which was a French colony, where they became the Cajun people.
Wow! So all of a sudden, your little vacation became in the field research.
That's right.
Oh, cool.
They also blackened some mean ass gator. Let me tell you, delicious.
It tastes like chicken.
It does taste like chicken.
Slimy
it's like chewy
chicken.
or chicken. Yeah. It's really good though.
Actually, I get it every time I go to the Houston airport.
Sweet.
There's a restaurant that does that. Okay, so now Ontario and Quebec are joined. There's been some tension, some armed fighting, a lot of arguing, and Britain has said, okay, lose the lieutenant general.
Yeah, or we're just going to tell them to take a seat. Like they just have to do what the provinces say. Stop being like little dicks about it. And what's crazy was there was no law. Mm-hmm. It's just like an order that came down from the colonial office that was like, yo, knock it off. We still have lieutenant governors. Every province has lieutenant governor. They just have to do whatever the legislature says. They're ceremonial now, kind of.
How do I get that job?
Honestly, you got to just kiss some like Liberal Party ass for fucking decades, and then you'll get it.
Okay.
Yeah, you have to be like a sort of respected and bland person.
Okay. I'm neither respected nor blamed.
You want to look up right now who the Lieutenant Governor of Ontario is? I don't even know.
Yeah, let's do it.
Let's just do it. Let's take a little break from this extremely, we'll give everyone a chance to catch their breath.
Inject a little bit of excitement into this thing.
Yeah, the Honorable Elizabeth, her name is Elizabeth Dowdeswell.
Oh, yeah.
Is the Lieutenant Governor of Ontario. Mm-hmm. Let's see. Let's learn more about her honor. She was a teacher and a university lecturer. She was in the government of Saskatchewan. She was the head of the Atmospheric Environment Service, during which she managed several public inquiries and royal commissions.
Hey.
Blah, blah, blah. Yes, she's like a kind of, moderate level politician.
Huh.
And intellectual.
Does Lieutenant Governor make good money?
That's a good question. Let's look that up too. I've never looked any of this up. Lieutenant Governor salary. People have been Googling it though. It auto-completed. No way. What? Holy shit.
How much?
Well, apparently PEI's Lieutenant Governor costs $650K a year. Oh, because of his staff and his big house, which is really pretty. They make $120,000. Which is similar to what a member of parliament makes. But that's not nothing. And they don't do labor anymore. They mostly show up for things and give awards and smile.
Wear wigs.
Yeah. Yeah, actually, so B. Libin on Twitter this week asked, would love an episode which explains what the monarch's purpose is now, both here in Canada and in the UK. That's a great question.
Tourism.
Yeah, I mean, tourism's a huge reason.
Isn't that
it's
that? As far as I can tell, that's really the big selling point of having a monarch.
Yeah, I mean, we don't need to have a whole episode about it, and it actually fits nicely into this episode. So maybe we'll get to it in more depth a bit later. But the lieutenant governors and the governor general of Canada are the arm of the monarchy in Canada still, and mostly they're just ceremonial. They're there to be the head of state, but they do serve kind of an important function, which is that they do have authority still in theory. And if the government is totally fucked and nobody agrees on anything and nothing can get done, the governor general or the lieutenant governor is the one who actually has the power to be fuck it, there's going to be an election. So there actually is somebody who has the ability to dissolve the parliament outside of the parliament, which is probably not a bad thing in the long run. Now, does it have to be the monarchy? That's a good question that I feel we should bring up later, but we'll get into that.
Okay.
Anyway, so
we have Ontario and Quebec.
Yes.
Joined at the belly, so to speak. And now we need New Brunswick and Nova Scotia to join the team.
That's right.
Why?
Okay. So fast forward.
Yeah.
We're in the 1860s now. Okay.
Right.
So what's
the Beatles at the height of their fame?
That's right. A young crooner named Bob Dylan is wooing the people in the saloons of Manhattan. No, none of that's happening. So we're in the 1860s. The American Civil War is broken out. Shit is getting crazy down there. So there's a lot of pressures that lead Canada to Confederation. I just said American Civil War. That was a really big one. Now, not many people know about what Canada did during the Civil War, and I was curious about it. And the second I started researching, I was like, oh, no wonder no one talks about this. And it's because Canada was technically neutral during the American Civil War, but every Canadian newspaper supported the Confederacy.
Wow.
Because they saw the Confederacy as a bullied underdog standing up to an oppressive government. Uh-huh. So Canadian newspapers were very pro-Confederate. Now, the average Canadian person generally supported the Union, even though their newspapers were pro-Confederacy. And 40,000 Canadians fought in the U.S. Civil War, almost all of them for the North.
Right.
Canadians fought in every battle of the Civil War. And there's many notable Canadians who fought in the Civil War, including the first black man who ever graduated from med school in Canada, went to the Civil War and was a doctor. And the guy who led the army unit that captured John Wilkes Booth after he killed Lincoln was a Canadian. Wow. So there's kind of notable Canadians swirling around. There. Yeah, they're sprinkled. I mean, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people fought in the Civil War. 40,000 Canadians it's not nothing. It's a pretty sizable number for a small colony, but it was less than 1% of the Canada's population. It's not a huge number of people.
Right.
But then the other fucked up thing was that it was a part of the Confederate battle plan to try to force the North into a two-front war with Canada. Just like how we beat the Nazis when they really went to Russia, right? Like when the Nazis started, when they broke their non-aggression pact with Stalin and started fighting a two-front war with Russia, suddenly it was possible for us to fuck them up, right? And so the Confederates, that was their plan. They wanted the North to go to war with Canada, and like Confederate soldiers made it to Canada and would like raid the North from Canada and like hide in Canada, and even and the Canadians would like capture them, but then like let them go with all the shit they raided. So like we helped the Confederacy and we helped the North. Also, we sold weapons to both sides freely. We transported Confederates on our ships and shit like that. Like it was
So
not.
we're not going to be your enemy, but we're also not going to be your friend.
So like no wonder we don't talk about it. Like we were not super morally sound in this.
Right.
Most Canadians did hate slavery, and slavery had been abolished in the British Empire for like 25 years at this point too.
Right. But as you said, Canada at this point was a bit of an unstable thing, wasn't it?
Yeah, it wasn't a country.
It wasn't
yet.
like a unified.
It wasn't a unified country at all.
government.
No, it was like
Yeah.
5 different countries at this time. Yeah,
Okay.
5 different colonies. So that's one of the big pressures. The big pressure is that people are worried that the North is going to start fighting Canada, right? And they're not just worried about it because it's going to be violent. The British Empire is worried it's going to cost a shitload of money, right? Because they've defended the North American colonies a lot of times at this point, and they're starting to kind of like do the math and wonder if it's worth it. So at this time in Britain, they're going, hey, if you guys want to become a country and leave the British Empire, maybe think about that. Like your parents are when they're like, here's a classified for a job and some apartments. If you want to think about moving out, maybe, I'm just saying it might be some good character building for you. The British Empire was like kind of cool with us leaving by this point. So that's one of the big pressures that's facing Canada. There's also railway economic pressure. So railways in the mid 19th century were like the Uber of the time. It's like everyone was fucking obsessed with railways and like building railways, and like the dudes building the railways were like these like gold rushy kind of like wealth chasing business guys.
Well, and again, there's a lot of corruption going on.
There's
at this time.
absolutely
there's
fucking
a lot
appalling
of
amount of
the
corruption.
Politicians are also members of the Grand Trunk Railway.
That's right.
Yeah.
And the politicians are getting paid basically
Yeah.
for railways being built. And the Grand Trunk Railway was a successful railway, but there were also like boondoggle railways like the one in Prince Edward Island or the one in Newfoundland. Those were both like not profitable railways.
Does boondoggle mean highly effective and economic?
No. Yeah, so there's a lot of pressure to unite all of the British colonies because a lot of people could make a shitload of money building a huge railroad. And in fact, building a huge railroad is in the Canadian Constitution still. It's like, by the way, you got to build this huge railroad. So that was one of the things that people wanted. People wanted to make that money, and they wanted to influence the politicians to make that money. But the real thing that directly led to Confederation was the province of Canada, which was combined Ontario and Quebec, was just fucked by this point. Like the fact that they had exactly equal power between French and English Canada meant that French and English Canada had to collaborate in order to form a government. So the governments were always like the conservatives from English Canada and the conservatives from Quebec agree to make a government. But then they would always fall apart, and it got to the point where they just couldn't do anything anymore. Right. They were so equally matched. There was no way to break the balance of power because like the minor parties were like kind of crazy fringe parties.
Right.
I mean,
now enter John A. Macdonald.
Well, that's right.
The great herder of cats.
Well, in truth, entered George Brown. George Brown was. Many people only know his name because there's a college in Toronto named after him, George Brown, and he founded the Globe and Mail. Well, it was just the Globe at the time. Right. So he was a newspaper editor and politician, and he was the head of what was called the Reform Party, which was like the hard left English party in Canada. And so his big thing was representation by population. He wanted English Canada to get the power it deserved. He was like hardcore Protestant and anti-Catholic. He was seen as like really hostile and xenophobic to French people. He was like personally very abrasive and like really vitriolic to his enemies. So people didn't like him. They considered him kind of like we would consider like a Kelly Leach or a Kevin O'Leary or something. He was like a fringe figure. And he was considered to never be a guy who was in government. But he, in the kind of constitutional deadlocks, John A. Macdonald is like the the conservative guy, right? So he's the one who's always in power. Brown and MacDonald hate each other. They've been enemies forever, right? But when MacDonald and Georges Etienne Cartier, who's like the French conservative guy, so MacDonald and Cartier have to work together to make a government, and they've started to not be able to do that anymore. Brown realizes, wait a minute, like I've got an idea. I can pitch confederation of all of the Canadian provinces.
Right.
Now, the reason that this was a good idea was because it would break up the 50-50 equality of Quebec and Ontario, right? So like the pitch was that they would make one government for the whole territory, like the whole British North America, all what became Canada, one federal government that would control kind of like the main stuff a country does, like foreign policy and customs and borders and tariffs and the military and stuff like that. And then the provinces themselves would control education, which is like kind of a code for like religion, because all education in Canada at this time was religious. Right. Education and health policy and some natural resources, although a lot of those also went to the federal government. So like basically he had this scheme to free Ontario from being kind of beholden to Quebec without making Quebec rise up and revolt against English Canada, which they would have if they felt like they were getting fucked over, right? So he realizes he can kind of pitch this thing so that he can get what he wants, even if he's not the guy who's in power. And it just so happened that all the maritime provinces were kind of casually having this like maritime union conference that was not supposed to be a big deal. This is in 1864. Right. So they're kind of having this maritime conference, and then the Canadians are like, hey, we want to come too from Ontario and Quebec to your conference and talk about a whole confederation of all the Canadas. And so they're like, wait, we've got a thing happening now, right? So the Premier of Nova Scotia, Charles Tupper, the Premier of New Brunswick, Leonard Tilley, Georges Etienne Cartier, George Coles from PEI, John A. Macdonald from Ontario, they all went and they met in Charlottetown. But interestingly, they also brought all of their opposition leaders. So that's why George Brown came. That's why Thomas Darcy McGee came, and Ned Whalen from PEI. That was one of the guys. Galt, yeah. All these guys, they all came. The reason there's so many Fathers of Confederation is because it was like every premier, or every like provincial leader, every provincial prime minister brought their guys and their opposition guys. And the reason they did that was so that they could be like, hey,
this isn't everyone decision.
And also like the Confederation pitch, they were in on it too.
Right.
So they can't be like, oh, I would have gotten such a better deal because they were here. Right. So anyway, they go to Charlottetown, they talk, it sounds like a good idea. They wine and dine. It's boring. They had a constitutional conference. They drank a shitload of booze and danced a lot. And Charles Tupper is like a huge womanizer, apparently, and flirted with a bunch of ladies and slapped a bunch of butts and, I don't know, maybe banged some people. Everyone was really coy about this kind of thing back then. Right. So there's like all these like Victorian ass euphemisms about it. And it's unclear exactly to me what exactly was going down. Like if I was writing this, I'd be like, Charles Tupper's hand caressed up her thigh. Like I'd like really get hustler about it. But back in the day, they had a bit more class.
He dropped his dress hanky on his left
shoe.
It was like,
no, it wasn't even like that. It was like, and Mr. Tupper did indeed show himself of an amicable disposition. And everyone's like, oh! Like it was like the most shocking shit they'd ever heard, right? Like everyone knows what that means. But like when you read it now, you're like, ugh. I feel like I have to cut my own penis off after reading this. Like, it's just like so sexless.
Right.
Anyway, they have a conference. It goes well. They all want to be a part of it. Newfoundland's not invited because everyone forgets to invite them, which is like really funny because it was just kind of assumed they'd want to do their own thing, which they did anyway, so whatever. And then they have another conference a couple weeks later. This was in July, I think, 1864. And then in October, they have another one at Quebec where they hammer it out what becomes the Canadian Constitution.
Yeah. PEI doesn't sign.
That's right. So
Nova Scotia and New Brunswick gets sold for 80 cents a head, I think.
Pardon?
80 cents per head is what they sold their provinces for.
What does that mean? I've never heard that term.
80 cents per person on the islands.
So they got like money? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
They received like payments?
Yeah, Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. And I think it works out to like 200 and something thousand and $300,000.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
I didn't know that there was like a direct cash transfer.
Yeah, well, that's the way it is in the play there.
Oh, cool. So PEI had this huge issue. Every province got in, and basically every province was facing a serious issue of some kind. They were facing many. They're like countries, basically.
Yeah.
But kind of Confederation held the promise of solving a lot of the big problems facing a lot of people. Obviously, Canada was finally going to get its deadlock broken, and English Canada was going to be able to grow and flourish the way it wanted. And French Canada was going to be able to preserve its culture and not get overwhelmed and destroyed. Like, those were what they wanted.
Right.
And then Prince Edward Island was facing this thing where most of the people on PEI were like farmers.
Isn't that, I just want to point out, isn't that such a funny like thing that here we are 150 years
It's exactly
later,
the same thing.
and it's the same.
It's exactly
like,
the same
Quebec's
debate.
MO is like, don't lose our culture, don't lose our
They've
language.
succeeded for this long.
And-
It's fucking impressive.
And English Canada is like, how can we make more of this usable?
Yeah, exactly. It's
You know?
like we're fighting the same battles. Let me tell you.
Yeah.
And not necessarily in a bad way.
No.
But
No, but it is interesting that 150
Yeah.
years goes by. And that's what
so on PEI, most of the people there were poor farmers, and most of them were working on land that was owned by like sassy absentee British people. So like rich British people own land. They paid like a shitty amount of money to these poor PEI people to work on the land. So the huge issue in PEI was like, let's buy the land and own it ourselves because we're fucking sick of this shit. It was almost like a socialist kind of pre-socialist dilemma. And so originally, like McDonald was like, yeah, of course we're going to give you the money to buy all the land. And then they bailed on that in Quebec. So that's why PEI backed out. When they realized they couldn't go back to people and be like, we're getting the land, then they were out.
Right.
And so that's why PEI stayed out.
They got that sick ferry boat.
That's right. That's right. That fucking ferry. And the bridge, which they
the
now
bridge.
have. Yeah. And in 1875, they did agree to help them buy the land.
Right.
Although I think they gave them less money than they thought they would. Whatever. There was some negotiation about it. That's why they came in the end. They agreed to buy the land.
Okay.
What's funny is that the big sticking point, at Quebec is when the whole thing's drawn up. So basically the way that it is now, the Constitution, that's what they made at Quebec. The big sticking point was, wait for it, the Senate. Everyone was like, this Senate sucks. It makes no sense. Why are these number of seats going to these number of people? This doesn't do anything. Why aren't they elected? What the fuck's going on? I was shocked to learn this.
Right.
When I went back and researched it. By the way, most of my knowledge of this comes from a book called 1867, How the Fathers Made a Deal by Christopher Moore, which is a very good book. Not comprehensive about Confederation, but a lot about like what was said to who when, and I thought that was interesting.
Yeah.
So they were all like, all the things that we complain about, they saw it before it even happened, and they were already complaining about it. But the idea was that there was this kind of concept in the British government that a government needed like dignified parts and essential parts. The essential parts actually did the government stuff, and the dignified parts just kind of gave the whole thing a governmental air that like, and there was like this like kind of theory that it like bolstered the effectiveness of the government to seem fancy.
Right.
You know what I mean? And so like, this was kind of
Well,
part
I
of
forgot
it.
who I was watching. It was an interview with some rock and roll guy. And the interviewer was saying like, so what I find interesting is you don't dress the way you do on stage,
Right.
in real life. And the guy's like, well, no, like people don't want to pay $60 to watch the guy I am right now to sing a song. They pay $60 to see the guy with, dreadlocks and a leopard skin vest and tight pants sing a song.
And doubling back around to B. Libin's question about what the monarchy does in Canada today, and what you said about tourism, like that's one of the most concrete things that I think you can argue for, is that like it makes the government fancy. It's fancy that we have a queen, and when the queen comes through, you feel fancy for having seen her or heard of her.
Sure.
It's like it just makes the government seem kind of like
Stalin
important.
made all the subways real like decadent, isn't it? It's like, whoa, if their subways are this nice, like, how under control must the government be?
Yeah, like I'm a pretty staunch anti-monarchist. Like I don't really get it. I don't really care about it. I like it as a
How do you not understand that power is bestowed by God
on the Windsors? On the Windsor family.
That's right.
No, but you know what? I got waved at by the Queen once, and I got butterflies in my stomach.
Of course.
And
There
like,
she is.
she drove past me when she was visiting Vancouver. I was at a bus stop. There were like 7 cop cars, and there she was. I was the only one around. And she waved at me. And I waved back at her. I was like, I'm waving at the Queen right now.
Right.
Like, it was even a cool moment for me. And
Did you see Philip?
No, he was like.
That's too bad.
He was like I think he was in bat form at the time.
Because if he had seen you, he probably would have thanked you for building the railroad.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. I think he was too busy sucking all of the blood out of some sort of like manservant or something. Who was?
Have you heard about that little village in, I think, the Amazon that like hails him as a god because he like was responsible in some humanitarian effort to like send a lot of stuff to their village, and they found photos of him, and then when he showed up, they like, it was totally C-3PO and the Ewoks. Like, he shows up and they're all just like, right,
really. And like in real life he's just like your weird racist uncle who's kind of harmless but kind of unpleasant in just a fancy coat. Like, that's who he is in real life. Yeah. Ugh, God, the monarchy. Yeah, so, holy crap, where were we? Oh, yeah, right, the Senate. So anyway, so even back in the day, people were pissed about the Senate, but they compromised on it because they wanted it to be, they wanted it to be less effective than the House of Representatives, because they believed, because they had come from the responsible government battle, that the legislature, the House of Commons, that was where the power was. That's where the power should be. And the House of Commons should clearly be the place where the power was. And the Senate should not be a competitor with the House of Commons. Okay. That was always what they wanted. I was shocked to learn that, and I'd never heard that even said before until I read this book. So that was kind of cool. It kind of like gave me a bit of a clue about why things are the way they are. You know what I mean?
Right.
So I thought that was nice. Anyway, it's 1864. Everyone goes back to their provinces. They have to get it ratified. Everyone faces opposition in some way. I mean, English Canada is all about it. They're cool with it. French Canada is kind of shifty about it. But, you know, Cartier kind of promises them that it's the best way for them to get out their own interests, right? New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, they all fight over it. It takes a long time. It takes years. But finally, all the provinces ratify it. And then it goes to, finally, in 1867, it goes to the British Parliament. And the first thing that happens is the British Colonial Office people look at it and they're like, whoa, 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 whoa. Like, how about we just say the Governor General can make all decisions? And they're all like, fuck you, write it down the way it's supposed to be. So it finally goes to the British Parliament, who pass it without even debating it. And in fact, John A. Macdonald was famously extremely grumpy about the fact that there was also a measure about dog licenses being passed on the same day that was debated for way longer than the Canadian Constitution.
Right.
So the Brits were like, finally, they're fucking moving out. Right. You sure you don't want to just leave the empire totally? And this was actually a good question. Why did we keep the monarchy? Why did we keep the British Empire? We had a choice. We had the option of saying we're leaving the empire when we made this constitution, but we chose to stay.
Is it because of like, it's like a little kid in their security blanket that like, even after you grow up and you're like, but I like it. I remember all the good times we had together.
I mean,
you
like,
kept me safe.
That's absolutely, it's absolutely like that, except instead of like a security blanket, it was more like memorizing your parents' credit card number. You know what I mean? Like they were like, keenly aware of the states to the south, right? And now that the Civil War was done by 1867, there was this concept in the United States for a long time called the Manifest Destiny, which was the idea that I think it was William Seward, who was like the Secretary of War for the post-Civil War government. The idea that it was the natural right of America to spread across the entire North American continent of the United States. So they had their eyes on Canada. Right. And so, and Ulysses S. Grant agreed with that. You know, he was going to become the president soon, a famously shitty president. But we knew that we could call on, if we stayed part of the British Empire, they would be obligated to defend us if America attacked. That was a huge part of it. And then also, we could have, you know, free trade with Britain, which we could have probably negotiated anyway, but we didn't have to. We didn't have to do all this extra work to like renegotiate our ties with Britain. And then British people could also invest in Canada quite easily, which they needed to do to create the big ass railroads that they had promised to create, right? So these were kind of the immediate reasons. I was a bit sad, to be honest, when I read all this stuff about Britain, because yeah, Canada's future would have been much more uncertain in the immediate after Confederation period. But I think that tying ourselves to Britain and its empire really affected Canada's character as a nation and affected our culture in a way that is invisible to us today. The fact that there was always a bigger, larger power who would save us, and that we were always kind of loyal to on some level.
Right.
I think that whatever that does to your mentality, we still have it. We've never broken the ties. Like we've never become our own country. In many ways, and we have certainly. I mean, we're different than Britain.
Yeah.
But we've never had to be like, it's us. We have to do this. No one's coming to help us. And I feel like you can feel that that's never happened to Canada. In Canada's culture, in the way people talk about Canada, in the way that they don't have ownership over their history and their stories.
It's like when you meet like someone who's like 22 and just out of university for the first time, and you're like, oh, life hasn't been hard on you yet.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
I mean, it was an interesting thing. I was like, wow, what a crossroads for our country this was, and I felt a bit melancholy about the one that we took. I'm so curious about what would have happened if we had just broken with the British monarchy, because they were cool with it. They were like, you can leave if you want to leave. We're fine with that happening. They were very clear.
Wow. It's like me in relationships.
Whoa. So Queen Elizabeth signed off on it finally in like March or April, and it came into effect on July 1st, 1867. So our big day is
Queen Elizabeth?
Oh, sorry, Queen Victoria.
Yeah.
Queen Victoria. Blah. We just talked about Queen Elizabeth. Yeah. So our big day, Canada Day, just commemorates the day that the thing came into effect. Everybody,
yay, we did it.
Yeah, and I think that's why it's anticlimactic. It's like I said, the battle for responsible government. Was contained a lot of the drama of the creating of the country. Once. Like half the battle was won already. You know what I mean? That's why Confederation itself is kind of just a bunch of dudes arguing about what the Senate is going to be, right? Because the fighting for the power had already happened, right? And then it was also decentralized the other way too. Like when, as you know well, being in the play that you're in right now, when Manitoba negotiates its entry into Confederation, there's also tension and violence, right?
Yeah.
But if all of that had happened at the same time, if the farmers' rebellions had happened in sync with the responsible government fight and the Red River Rebellion happened at the same, then maybe we'd have the American Revolution for us.
Right.
But because there was like 70 years separating them, because the political power was won, out of lockstep with the violent revolutions, these things just kind of it never hit the boiling point, right? It simmered, but it never boiled.
Interesting.
Yeah,
and that's where we're left. I guess the that's Confederation, and then
that's kind of what it was.
Like some of the really interesting stuff in Canadian history
happens after Confederation.
Thereafter.
Yeah, like the Pacific scandal is a huge thing, which is basically like, as we talked about vote buying, right? Like they would pay you to vote. So it turned out that when John A. Macdonald, his first election after Confederation, he was given a huge amount of money from the railway companies to buy people's votes and then give those railway companies the contract to build the railway to the Pacific, which became this massive scandal. So there's like shit like that. There's lots of there's the whole story of Louis Riel and the Red River Rebellion, which is like a deeply sad story that also touches on the horrible injustices done to Aboriginal people, who, by the way, were completely excluded from Confederation entirely, and were not even considered part of the equation. They were considered like foreign countries, basically.
Right.
Most of the Aboriginal people at this time lived in Rupert's Land, which was the huge area that was owned, heavy air quotes, owned by the Hudson's Bay Company because they said so. Right. I really want to do an episode on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report, and we will talk about Canada's relationship to its Indigenous people then. I'm reading the unabridged report right now for a project that I'm doing, which is 3,000 pages long. So I'm learning a lot about this stuff, and I'm excited in a horrible way to talk about it because it's a deeply troubling story and very sad.
Great. I'm looking forward to that episode.
Yeah.
Is there anything else you feel you need to add in and around Confederation?
I mean, no. It is kind of boring. There's nothing wrong with thinking it's boring.
It is boring.
But it's so interesting that it also undeniably created our country the way that it is today. Like
Yeah.
you can directly draw the links from what was
And-
going on then to what's happening now.
And that's the very interesting thing for me is like is seeing the cracks that still exist as blemishes, and not necessarily in a bad way, but see the ripples through time. I guess is maybe a better way
Yeah.
to look at it.
And I mean-
the ripple of this event still exists in this province.
Yeah, it's worth saying too. I don't lionize these men at all. Like they're very flawed individuals who held prejudices that would be completely unacceptable to us in modern day society. And in fact, I don't know, people get kind of whimsical sometimes about the British Empire. Like I stumbled on this like pro-monarchy Canadian site while I was researching this that just was like, my eyes were like dinner plates while I was reading it. It was so freaky. But like people really are like, wow, we have this imperial Canadian heritage. Like, guys, Victorian England had more in common with contemporary Saudi Arabia than anywhere else. Like, it was a fucking regressive society with like deeply dogmatic views of gender and religion and violence and racism. Like it was a lot like Saudi Arabia, a lot like it.
I love when people can type on their keyboard into their computers, onto the internet, onto their social media websites. Boy, oh boy, do I wish how the Romans did things.
Yeah,
you know?
right.
Where do you think your fucking computer came from? It came from us stopping doing shit that doesn't make sense. It doesn't work.
Yeah. So I say that to say that I have no. I do not. These men are not heroes of mine.
Yeah.
I think they are tenacious and intelligent people, and there's a lot to learn from them. And also, it must be said that they succeeded at doing, at least so far, 150 years later, they succeeded at doing what they tried to do,
Right.
which was unite all of these colonies into a single unit and give French Canada its place and its distinct status and its distinct society, and to give. And French Canada fought for just the mechanisms to keep themselves in existence the way that they chose, and that's happened. They've come within a razor's edge of leaving many times, but they haven't yet.
So here's a question about the nature of Confederation. Only because we talk about it. I don't think I ever talk about it specifically in the play.
Are you asking like what is in Confederation? What did they agree to?
A little bit, because there's a few characters in the play that make a lot of arguments of like it's not a true confederation. It's like it's a federation disguised as a confederation.
Right. Okay. So a confederation, as opposed to a federation, is like a unification of all of the different colonies. Right.
Yeah.
A federation is a bunch of different territories that agree to work together but stay kind of separate, right? A confederation would be a single strong government linking them all together. And how strong the federal government, like the main government, versus each individual province's government is like basically the whole trick of the thing. You want to figure out the balance of powers between the federal government and the provinces. And looking at America, embroiled in the Civil War, they were like, you know what the problem with America is? The states have too much power. So we need a stronger central government that will be able to rein the provinces in if they do crazy shit like try to secede from the Union because of slaves or whatever.
Right.
And so originally, actually, the Canadian Constitution, the Canadian Constitution, the British North America Act, the thing they wrote during Confederation, basically says, like, here's how the government's structured, here's what the federal government can do, here's what the provinces can do, here's how the Senate works. We're going to build a railroad. We're obligated to pay this much. This, blah, 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 blah. Here's how the ridings are divided. It doesn't say anything about a Charter of Rights and Freedoms. It doesn't say anything about, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It's like really technical because it's about giving the governments powers. And a lot of that stuff was just assumed. Like they didn't feel the need to enshrine it yet because the judiciary didn't function the way that it does nowadays, right? They didn't have the idea that like the courts would be looking at these documents to like make huge social changes through law, right? Like that, like through lawsuits, like that wasn't a feature of the society yet. But actually, they made too strong a central government. And the first article of Confederation, it's really funny actually, because if you go to it now on the Government of Canada's website, you can look at the British North America Act, and it says like this is the British North America Act, Article 1. And then it's like erased. It's like
Right.
all crossed out because it's been struck down already. And what it was it used to be that the federal government could cancel any legislation passed by a province. It was called the power of disallowance.
Okay.
But the very first premier of Ontario, a guy named Oliver Mowat, realized there was no way that was going to fly, because if everyone believed in responsible government, that the legislature should represent the people, you could argue that the provincial legislature had to represent its people too. And if the federal government could cancel it, that was a breach of responsible government, which was like a central principle of the whole Canadian thing. So he successfully got that struck down just like a couple decades after Confederation. So now the first thing in our Constitution is actually no longer a part of our Constitution. Yeah.
Oh, that's funny.
That's the kind of stuff that's in there.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. And so if you're saying like it's not a true confederation, the person who is saying that would mean the states have too much power. The central government's not strong enough. It doesn't bring them all together enough. But I feel like, as we've kind of talked about, for better or for worse, the balance that they were trying to strike, they did strike.
Cool.
Anyway,
And that's how our country
that's how
happened.
Canada became a Canada baby.
Yay! Or boo.
Or boo,
however
yeah,
you feel about it.
I feel pretty conflicted about it, to be honest. Like I can't even wholeheartedly say I love my country anymore. Reading the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report is really doing a number on me.
For sure.
But like, it's given so many people so much opportunity and taken so much opportunity from so many other people. It exists for better or for worse. It's become a fully functional country. It's large, it's diverse. You know, it contains. It's endured this long. It's impressive that it has, for what a strange project it is. You know, you look at other countries.
Yeah.
Canada's quite different from many of them, and its founding is very different from many of them.
Well, one thing, you know, I guess this is more to do with like opinions versus like policy. But when I watch watching the news on what happens in Canadian government versus like U.S. government, certainly these days, but like also kind of always, has been like a bit more quaint. And I've always found like, oh, that's like nice that that Canada's arguing about this kind of social progressive issue,
Right.
And the U.S. is like, should we like hang all the poor people, or
Just
not?
simply burn them.
Yeah, exactly. You're like,
yeah.
maybe we don't live in such a bad
I
place.
think that's another one of those symptoms of the like we're still Britain's little baby.
Right.
You know, like we were free to worry about this stuff because we weren't fighting constantly for survival. Although
Right.
you know, we were for a while, but by the time we got to Confederation, you know, pretty quickly once we established Saskatchewan and Alberta, and that the border, like what's now today the southern border with the U.S., was drawn. There were disputes about it, but they were pretty minor, and it became clear pretty quickly the U.S. probably wasn't going to invade us anymore.
Right.
And after that point, we've never really had a serious threat to our territory. And I think that really changes our mentality too about what our priorities are.
Yeah.
You know? Yeah.
Well, there you go.
There you go.
Oh, Canada.
Hey, the guy who wrote the music for "O Canada" served in the U.S. Civil War.
Stan Rogers?
No, Celine Dion.
Celine Dion, right.
Yeah.
Wow.
Okay, well, we've had a fun time today
Yes.
talking about Confederation. Certainly,
Yeah.
I was interested reading about it. If you got questions, if any of this doesn't make sense, if it was super boring and you want me to redo this episode, except with like explosions and lasers and rap music,
We will do that.
yeah, just let us know.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you know, if leave us a comment on our Twitter or our SoundCloud. We're at Explain Jamie. Explain it to Jamie. Just Google us. We're on Facebook. We're on Twitter. We're on Instagram.
We'll
we're on
get
all
it.
the things. Yeah,
Richard and I read our messages.
We do.
directly.
Yeah,
There's no one working for us in this operation.
That's right. No, it's just us.
You send a message, it goes straight through to Richard's phone.
Yeah. Big thanks to B Libin on Twitter for listening and for posing the questions they posed today. It
And
was a great
for
way
keeping
me to
on
think about it.
lipping, you know?
Yeah, keep on living. Be living, y'all. Yeah, so until next week, I'm Richard.
I'm Jamie, and this has been Explain It to Jamie. Woo!